All toxic versions depend on the enforced ignorance of the young. It's only by keeping your young people ignorant of other religions that you can preserve this. The thing about religions is they're changing all the time. They are changing constantly. They've changed more in the last 200 years than they changed in the last 2,000 years, and they'll probably change in the next 20 years as much as they've changed in the last 200.
I know why the universe obeys laws. God is both a physical and, you may say, a moral lawgiver. I know why our rationality can comprehend the universe out there. It's because we are created in God's image.
First, let's just get a few facts on the table so that we have something properly to reason about. Here you see a map of the world, and it just shows, this is, I suppose, somewhat out of date. It shows the world's religions color-coded, so Islam is in green, and Buddhism is in purple, Hinduism is in brown, Christianity is in yellow. And according to the World Christian Encyclopedia, which is really the sort of authoritative book about this, the only religion that's growing today of these major categories is Islam. And it's growing almost entirely by a differential birth rate, not by conversion in. I know there's a sense out there that say Christianity must be booming, must be growing too, but there's really no evidence of that. For instance, the Southern Baptists now are baptizing about the same number they were back in the 50s each year. There's really no change in membership. And there was a nice piece in the New York Times just about a year ago, October 2006, about the National Association of Evangelicals, which had a study. They were really worried that youth were falling away from the evangelical churches at a great rate, quoting one of them. If current trends continue, only 4% of teenagers will be Bible-believing Christians as adults. So I think you should temper your hunch that religions are growing at a great rate in this country. What they are doing, I think, is growing louder, but not necessarily growing in numbers. They're becoming more vocal, more aggressive, more obvious in many ways. Another point that's often made is that you'll notice on this map there's no difference shown between the United States Christianity and Europe as a Christian. This is a very sort of rough cast map. And one of the points that people always make is how much more religious the United States is than, say, Western Europe. And this is true, and one might wonder why. Maybe Dinesh will want to speak about that later, but there's one set of facts that I think everybody should have in front of them, and that is that, let's talk family values for just a minute. If you compare the United States with Western Europe, the homicide rate is much higher here than there. This sexually transmitted disease rate, much higher here than there. Teen pregnancy rate, higher here than in Europe. Also, abortion rates, higher here than in Europe. So this vision of the godless, secularized Europe being a place where family values are in deep trouble seems to be exactly wrong. Now, maybe we're more religious because we have to be, because we're such sinners, but there might be other explanations of that. Now, this is a map which shows the rough breakdown of different religions. You'll see that Christianity, which includes all kinds of Christians, is by far the largest percentage of the world's religion. But notice that Islam is only slightly more than the non-religious. And there are roughly twice as many non-religious, more than twice as many, 3 times as many as Buddhists. And in fact, the group that's growing the fastest in the world is not Islam, it's the non-religious. Now, I like facts like this, and I think everybody should know them because there's some surprises. I think probably some of these already are facts that you didn't have under your belt. And I've made a proposal, and this is what we were going to debate about, what I propose that we debate about. My proposal for what I'm calling the fourth R, there's reading, writing, arithmetic, and I've actually proposed a compulsory curriculum on world religions for all schools. So here's my proposal, that education on world religion for all our children in public and private schools, and for homeschoolers. This would be compulsory. And the idea was that it would cover history, creed, rituals, music, symbols, ethical commands, and prohibitions. That's it. Just well-attested, non-controversial facts that everybody can agree to about the world's religions, and that should be a curriculum which starts in grade school, goes into middle school and high school. Now, I believe as strongly as anybody in the principle of freedom of religion. So notice that this in no way violates freedom of religion. As long as you teach your children this curriculum, you can teach them anything else you want. Anything else you want, provided it doesn't disable them from further informing themselves. So it honors the principle of freedom of religion. Now, I've been discussing this proposal since I put it in my book for a year and a half now, and I've had the support, actually, of a lot of even right-wing Christian leaders who say, this is great, yeah, we're all for it. But Dinesh is on record as opposing it. Here's what he has to say. He says, Daniel Dennett urges that the schools teach religion as a purely natural phenomenon, and then he goes on to say, by this he means that religion should be taught as if it were untrue. Oh no, that's not what it means, and I've never said that. And this is simply a misrepresentation by Dinesh. I expanded on my point on the blog on faith, which some of you may have seen, and I thought it was such an obvious implication that I put it in parentheses. I said, notice that the truth or falsity of any religious doctrines would not be included in the curriculum, since not a single point of religious doctrine is agreed upon as straightforward fact by the world community. So Dinesh has misrepresented my position, and maybe that's why he is opposed to it. I don't know. Maybe now that he understands it better, he'll be in agreement of it. We'll see. Now, my reason for this is not the reason he suggests. He thinks I'm trying to wipe out religion. On the contrary, it's my recommendation for how to preserve the best in religion and get rid of just the stuff that we all want to get rid of, the toxic stuff. And it's a rather simple argument. All religions have toxic versions therein. That is, there are antisocial, fanatical elements in every major religion, in Hinduism, in Islam, in various kinds of Christianity, and so forth. And as near as I can see, this is an empirical claim. I haven't done direct research on it, but combing the literature seems to me pretty clear. All toxic versions depend on the enforced ignorance of the young. It's only by keeping your young people ignorant of other religions that you can preserve this. So my sort of public health measures say just don't permit that enforced ignorance to go on. Informing the young, we inoculate them against toxic forms of religion.
Religious belief behaves like inherited culture, not verified truth. Pew found that 86% of U.S. adults were raised in a religion, and 80% were raised Christian. That matters because religious upbringing strongly predicts adult belief. When people get distance from childhood training, the numbers crack. U.S. Christian identity fell from 78% in 2007 to 62% in 2023 to 24. Even Proverbs 22:6 gives away the method. Train children early before they can seriously question it.
And my understanding of this is as follows. A religion that can survive under this sort of free information deserves to survive. It's a benign form of religion. Let it flourish. And a religion that can't survive without the enforced ignorance of the young deserves to go extinct. But I don't know. Maybe Dinesh disagrees with that. We'll see. He quotes me. This is something Dinesh does in his book. He quotes in a context of disparagement, but you're never quite sure if he agrees with what he's quoting or not. Parents, he's quoting me now, parents don't literally own their children the way slave owners once owned slaves, but are rather their stewards and guardians, and ought to be held accountable by outsiders for their guardianship. which does imply that outsiders have a right to interfere. I stick by that. I think that's true. And I want to know, does he dissent from this statement? He presents it as if he disagrees. I'd like to know, does he actually dissent from this statement? So what kind of facts would we teach in this curriculum? I'm just going to whirlwind tour the facts. What do you suppose this is? This is several million people on the banks of the Ganges River as seen from outer space, one of the largest congregations of human beings ever in history. Now that's a really interesting phenomenon that cries out for an explanation. What on earth explains such an amazing congregation of bipeds? Well, it's, of course, this is a Hindu country, and the Hindu religions are older than Christianity, older even than Judaism, and they, unlike say Christianity, they don't have a sort of single founder. Their name for the highest god is Brahman, and everybody has a soul, an Atman, and if you perfect and purify your soul, that's nirvana, and you become one with Brahman. But in addition to Brahman, they have lots of gods. They have, for instance, Ganesh, the Indian god, and Lakshmi, the god of light. And they have avatars, which are gods come to earth, and they have names that are familiar to you, I'm sure, such as Krishna and Rama. And they have their holy texts, the Upanishads and the Vedas and so forth. And then you know also about the sacred cows. Even meat eaters in India, by and large, don't eat beef. They may eat other animals, but beef eating is pretty well out for the people in India. Except, I guess, for Christians, like the Christians in India. Now, then, moving along very quickly, here we have Islam. By the way, this is not a picture of Muhammad. As you know, they don't like to have pictures of Muhammad. That's Ali, his son-in-law. And it was the murder of Ali way back in 662, in the very early days of Islam, which led to the split, which we know today as the Sunnis and the Shias. Ali was the fourth caliph. As you know, Muslims are supposed to pray 5 times a day. They're forbidden to drink alcohol, and they hope to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, as you see in the pictures. Then we have the various brands of Christianity: Roman Catholicism and Russian Orthodoxy and Greek Orthodoxy, and Protestant denominations by the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And just for local color, I put on the top, on the right there, the mother church of the Church of Christ Scientists right here in Boston. And then down in the lower right-hand corner is the Mormon Tabernacle. And I'd certainly want students to learn about the Mormons, too, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. On the left, you see the angel Moroni, who Joseph Smith tells us came to him. Let me get the date right. I don't want to make a mistake. In 1823, on the 21st of September, the angel Moroni appeared to Joseph Smith, and then he came back 4 years later with, what I'm reporting, of course, is not, this is Mormon doctrine, Mormon creeds. I'm not saying it's true, I'm just saying this is what Mormons believe. He brought with him these golden tablets on which were written Egyptian symbols of some kind, and with the aid of some magic stones, Joseph Smith was able to translate them, and that's where we get the Book of Mormon. So we'd certainly want people to know about that. And then here, more recent religions still talk about Latter-day. This is just the 50th anniversary of the John Frum religion on the island of Tanna. This started after World War II. GIs on a neighboring island of Efate came in, they built an airstrip, they had all kinds of amazing cargo that the people on the island of Tanna had never seen, and they wanted some of that cargo, and so they decided that the GIs were sort of like gods, and they started a religion. They used the American flag, they dress up in sort of their idea of GI costumes, they carry bamboo imitation rifles, and they get into formations, and they're waiting for John Frum John Frum? Who's John Frum? Well, there was nobody in the U.S. military named John Frum. It seems to be a corruption of John from America. And they're waiting for him to come down from the volcano with lots of cargo and wonderful gifts. And they've built an airstrip with sort of a bamboo flight tower and so forth. So there, you want people to know about that. Okay. Now, do parents have the right to keep their children ignorant of facts like these about the world's religions? I don't think so. And I think just knowing all of these facts and a lot more that they would get, not in 5 minutes, but over, little dribbles and dribbles in their curricula over their school years, this would be a good thing for everybody. I want to know, if Dinesh thinks no, what is he afraid of? Is it the truth, maybe? These are just uncontroversial facts about the world's religions. I think everybody should know them. Now here's the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Here's some interesting facts about it. It started off as a church. Then it became a mosque, and now it's a museum. Isn't that interesting? Who knows what might happen next? It's hard to say. Here's the Vatican. Maybe in the life of your children or your grandchildren, it will become the European Museum of Roman Catholicism. Maybe Mecca will become Disney's Magic Kingdom of Allah. Who knows? The thing about religions is they're changing all the time. They are changing constantly. They've changed more in the last 200 years than they changed in the last 2,000 years. And they'll probably change in the next 20 years as much as they've changed in the last 200. And that's why it's important that everybody know about religions. So, and I don't know if Dinesh wants to disagree with this, but I think it's pretty clear that religions are human inventions. You've just seen quite a wonderful variety of odds and ends of religions. Those are human inventions. Now, they're not like the telephone, not Alexander Graham Bell. It's more the way music or language are inventions. They're human productions, but they have an evolutionary history.
One perfect God should produce one clear truth. Christianity fails that test badly. Protestants use 66 books in the Bible, while Catholics use 73, and other Christian traditions use even more. These are not small details. These groups disagree over what counts as God's actual word. The Bible itself says, God is not the author of confusion in 1 Corinthians 14:33. Yet Christianity's own history is confusion, edits, councils, splits, and human decisions wearing holy clothes.
Religions have evolved over thousands of years. In fact, there have been uncounted tens of thousands of religions that have sprung up over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. Religions start up so fast that websites can't keep up with the new ones. Most of them have a half-life of a few weeks. A few last a generation or two. Some of them, only a few, you saw them on the initial list, last for even several thousand years. Even for several thousand years. But not in their original form. They've evolved and evolved and evolved and evolved over that time. Here's Gustav Klimt's wonderful painting of the Tree of Life. And I thought I'd just pause. How am I doing for time? Oh, good. To give a secular vision of how wonderful all of this is. And think about the Tree of Life. This is not a scientific diagram. This is an artistic diagram. Every plant, animal, bacterium, fish, bird, all of these things have evolved, descended from unicellular organisms that first appeared on this planet over 3 billion years ago. Not only the organisms, but the coral atolls and the beaver dams and the spider webs and the cities and the canals and the churches and the cathedrals and the forts and the bridges. All of these things are fruits on the Tree of Life. And over that period of time, they have become excellent, beautifully designed, sometimes with a lot of human intervention, sometimes Not. They have all evolved, and it's all just wonderful. It is fantastic. I look around and I am so glad to be alive. This world is so full of just plain wonderful stuff. And from a sunset to a musical performance. And I wish there was somebody to whom I could properly express my gratitude for all of this wonderful stuff. But there isn't. There's nobody the appropriate recipient of my thank you. So what I do instead is I just thank goodness. The very stuff that I'm just marveling at. There is all this goodness, and it's not just good bridges, good wings, good eyes, good tools. It's morally good systems of law. There is moral goodness in addition to engineering goodness, in addition to the goodness of a good baseball player or a good antelope. There is the goodness of human morality. And all of these things evolved. Where did it come from? It bubbled up from below. Now, this is a hard idea for a lot of people to understand. This is a page from a creationist pamphlet. I love this. I got this years ago. Do you know any building that didn't have a builder? Yes, no. Do you know of any painting that didn't have a painter? Yes, no. Do you know of any car that didn't have a maker? Yes, no. If you answered yes for any of the above, give details. Take that, you evolutionist, you. This piece of propaganda is wonderfully, it wears its heart on its sleeve. It finds the whole idea that there could be anything, any examples, it's just so laughable as to be a joke. And then along came Darwin, and he showed exactly that it wasn't a joke at all. Darwin's great idea was written about just a few years later by Robert Beverly Mackenzie, and I love this quote, so bear with me. In the theory with which we have to deal, absolute ignorance is the artificer, so that we may enunciate as the fundamental principle of the whole system that in order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it is not requisite to know how to make it. The caps are in the original. This proposition will be found on careful examination to express in condensed form the essential purport of the theory, and to express in a few words all Mr. Darwin's meaning, who by a strange inversion of reasoning seems to think absolute ignorance fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom in the achievement of creative skill. Yeah, exactly right. And it is a strange inversion of reasoning. Some people just don't get it. They just can't get it. Many very distinguished thinkers just can't get it. Here's Paul Davies, a physicist, writing in '92. He says, the human mind can be no trivial detail, no minor byproduct of mindless, purposeless forces. Well, why would something that was a byproduct of mindless, purposeless forces have to be trivial? Why couldn't it be important? It's because Davies unconsciously, I think, adheres to what I will call the trickle-down theory of goodness. Nothing can be good unless there's something much better on high that is its source. But there's just no reason to believe that. It makes sense of our past. We never saw a shoe make a cobbler. We never saw an arrow make a Fletcher. We're in Fletcher school. Fletchers were people that made arrows. So it looks like it always takes a big, fancy, wonderful thing to make a less thing. And some people just don't get it. One of the people who doesn't is Dinesh in his book. He just articulates the trickle-down theory as if it was just obvious. You just don't get the point. Now, finally, let's talk about God. It used to be people really did believe that God existed, and by God they meant a very specific, concrete, identifiable type of God. Now, how many of you believe that Mount Everest exists? Good. How many of you can pick Mount Everest from these four pictures? I thought not. Yeah, we've got one or two people. Yeah, It's amazing. You can know that Mount Everest exists and not be able to pick it out. That's okay. So maybe something like that is going on with God. But in fact, I think what we see is an evolution of the concept of God. It starts off like Mount Everest. It's a really very grand and concrete, it's Yahweh, who's basically modeled on a warlord, a triumphant, militaristic, jealous, demanding leader. And then this is gradually turned into the ground of all being. What's that? Well, it's not an agent, doesn't have arms and legs, doesn't speak, doesn't listen. It's wonderful, but it has been pretty well, has shed most of its features. To the point where Peter de Vries, the novelist, wrote a novel where he had a character, an ultra-liberal minister, say, "It is the final proof of God's omnipotence that he need not exist in order to save us." That's the Reverend Mackerel in the Mackerel Plaza. So that's deliberate comedy, but sometimes truth is funnier than fiction. God is so great that the greatness precludes existence. That's from a book by Raimundo Panikkar, and it is deadly serious.
Religion wants credit for beauty, morality, and life itself, but science has already shown a better explanation. Natural selection can build complex eyes, wings, brains, and behavior without a designer. Cooperation and compassion also have evolutionary roots. They helped humans survive in groups. Christianity's God looks less like perfect truth and more like an ancient tribal ruler. Even Exodus 25 calls him jealous and says children can be punished for their parents' sins. That is not divine morality. That is primitive power.
So what we've seen is that the picture of God has gradually become more and more foggy. It's lost its detail. I'm going to close then with just one puzzling quote from Dinesh's book. He says, in that disparaging tone of his, that I fear a toxic religious mania could end human civilization overnight. Well, I do. I mean, have you been paying attention to Pakistan and Iran? Actually, I'm more afraid that some self-righteous, factually challenged neocon in the Pentagon will decide that a nuclear strike might make some really good sense. So I want to know, don't you? Don't you fear this? Because I really do. Now, I'm going to end then with some questions for Dinesh. I really do want to know if he approves of my proposal for compulsory education on world religions. And if not, why not? And I want to know if he will apologize for misrepresenting. And I want to know, does he fear that religious conviction might lead to a nuclear attack? And if not, why not? And I want to know if he agrees that John Frum, Ganesh, the angel Moroni, and the angel Gabriel are human inventions. And I also want to know, because he's not clear where he stands on evolution. Do you agree that our planet has had life for billions of years, that all life forms are descended from unicellular ancestors on the tree of life? Those are questions for Dinesh to answer. Thank you very much.
See, I have a wide podium here. I guess I didn't have to wear pants. Well, I'm trying to decide in the time I have whether I should rebut Professor Dennett or just jump into my own thoughts. I think what I'll do is touch on a couple of points that he makes and then come back in my rebuttal and address them more fully. First of all, let's begin with a couple of factual errors. Is religion growing? Globally, the answer is yes. In the West, the data is debatable. Europe, of course, is fairly secular. In America, we've certainly seen a resurgent atheism. But worldwide, there's really no debate. Professor Dennett really didn't cite any sources. I'll cite one, the historian Philip Jenkins, his book, The New Christendom. He points out that there is a rapidly growing religious revival throughout the world. I'm from India, and anyone who's from there will tell you that there is Hinduism resurgent in India, not in the number of nominal Hindus, but in the level of devotion. Christianity is spreading like wildfire in Asia and in Africa. In many African countries, the number of Christians 100 years ago was like 5%. Now it's about 50%. I don't know what you call that, but I call it growth. Look at South Korea, a continent that had virtually no Christians several decades ago. It now is over 50% Christian. You've got churches that have 100,000 members. There are tens of thousands of South Korean missionaries that are coming to Europe, and some even to America. Many of the European cities, if you look at the pastors, they're from South Korea. So I just want to begin by saying that I'm happy to have a debate. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but everyone is not entitled to their own facts. Okay, now, to Dan's proposal about teaching religion. My objection is not so much to the proposal as to the sort of dripping elitist contempt in which it is couched. I mean, imagine if I were giving the same course that Professor Dennett gave you in miniature. I would give it very differently. I would say, all right, let's teach all the belief systems in the world, but let's include Dan's belief system, which is in a sense a kind of metaphysically grounded Darwinism. Let's also show the influence of that Darwinism in shaping social Darwinism, sterilization. Let's show the influence of Darwinism in the Nazi movement in Germany. Let's assign Richard Weikart's book From Darwin to Hitler, which shows, for example, that the Nazis were inspired really by two main currents, social Darwinism on the one side and Nietzschean atheism on the other. The combination of the will to power and survival of the fittest were essentially recruiting slogans for the Nazis. I would moreover say that instead of crying crocodile tears about the Inquisition, which occurred 500 years ago, and in which over the space of 350 years, some 2,000 people were killed, which apparently keeps Dan awake at night, let's focus a little bit more on the crimes of atheism, which didn't occur in ancient times. Let's not just focus on the Salem witch trials. We can pick up the tourist guide and realize that despite Arthur Miller's play, the number of people killed in the Salem witch trials was precisely 18. Now that is 18 too many, I'll grant you, but it doesn't even compare to what atheist regimes have done, again, not in ancient times, but in our own lifetime, in the last century. I'm not just talking about Mao in China or Stalin in Russia. I'm also talking about Pol Pot. Here's a guy in the space of 3 years who killed 2 million people. What about Ceausescu, Enver Hoxha, Fidel Castro, Kim Jong-il? Atheist murders in the name of atheism are still going on. Now, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, says, oh yes, but the religious crimes were in the name of religion, but the crimes of atheism were not in the name of atheism. This is kind of what happens when you let a biologist out of the lab. Because here is a guy who has apparently a zero comprehension of history. All you have to do is open up the Communist Manifesto. All you have to do is look at the atheist regimes, which said very explicitly, we want to create a new man and a new utopia, freed from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality. So even bin Laden in his wildest dreams could not begin to rival the body count of atheist regimes, which begins not in the thousands or the tens of thousands, but in the millions and the tens of millions. An ocean of blood and a mountain of bodies produced by atheism in recent history.
The atheism caused mass murder argument falls apart when you check the details. South Korea is not over half Christian. Pew reports only 32% Christian and 52% religiously unaffiliated. Nazi evil was built on race, nationalism, and a twisted Reich church, not a lab full of atheists. The Khmer Rouge killed for a Maoist class utopia, not because disbelief told them to. Blaming atheism for dictators is lazy. Power killed. Dogma killed. Blind obedience killed.
Now, so I think we should include all that in the course. I think it would be a valuable factual addition to what our children should learn. Now, what about this idea about, is God a man-made invention? Professor Dennett, Dan, says that there is not a single point in religious doctrine that has any factual basis whatsoever. I'm really not sure what he means by this. I assume the Ten Commandments, for example, would count as religious doctrine. I would grant you that the first three commandments are in the theological sphere or the sphere of revelation. I would suggest all the other items are points of doctrine that are completely within the orbit of reason. We can debate whether children should honor their parents or steal or covet your neighbor's wife. I know that there are some people in academia who think that may be a good idea, but most people around the world think that that's a pretty damaging way to organize a society. So morality might well have a universal basis, and in that sense is completely in the domain of fact. I'm not saying it's established fact. I mean, it can be debated in those terms. I want to turn, though, a little bit more deeply to this issue of the existence of God, because that's kind of what we're debating here, and I want to do it purely by appealing to the same reason and science and evidence that Dan has relied on in his opening statement. Now, for a couple of hundred years, it did appear that scientific evidence was cutting, you might say, against theism. We had Copernicus showing that the Earth is not the center of the universe. The Earth goes around the sun. We had Newton with his idea of the clockwork universe, the idea the universe is a kind of machine. It might require some divine jump starting, but it doesn't require divine sustenance or intervention. Then we have Darwin's idea, which Dan has sort of been excited about, the idea that so we can have design, but no designer. But that was basically 150 years ago. I want to suggest that there have been startling recent developments in the last 100 years in physics, in astronomy, that strongly support theism, strongly support the idea of a creator, and are invulnerable to Darwinian attack. Let me begin the story sort of this way. About 1,500 years ago, somebody posed a question to the church father Augustine, a very interesting question, which goes kind of this way. When you think of time, time goes back, but no matter how far back it goes, you can always think of it going further back. So if you say 5,000 years ago, someone could say 5,001 years ago. 1 million years ago, 1,000,001 years ago. It's kind of impossible to think of time as having any kind of a beginning. You can always retreat further into the past. And the question for Augustine was very simple. Could God have created the universe? And if he did, what was he doing before that? How did God occupy his time prior to creating a universe? And to this question, Augustine gave an astounding answer. He said, in effect, God created time along with the universe. In other words, before the universe, and we have to put the word before in quotation marks, there was no time. Once upon a time, there was no time. A kind of startling idea. Except that today, if you walk into an introductory physics course, you will learn that one of the direct implications of the Big Bang is that not only matter, but space and time had a beginning. In other words, one of the implications of the Big Bang is that not only did all the stuff of the universe, but space itself and time itself come into existence at a discrete point, what scientists call a singularity. This, I would suggest, is modern support. It's not a proof. We're not here debating proofs. We are debating evidence that would seem to suggest that all of nature, all of matter came into existence at a given time. That, I would suggest, tends to corroborate something Augustine said with no evidence behind him. He claimed that, in effect, he got it from theology or he got it from revelation. My point is, Augustine didn't write to force agreement with science. Augustine stated a theological proposition, and modern science has come 1,500 years later to agree with him. Here's a second thought. In recent decades, scientists have asked the following question, and that is, why does the universe have the values that it does? Our universe has an incredibly wide and diverse set of very precise values. You can almost think, in fact, Lee Smolin, the physicist, whom Dan cites in his book, speaks about God as sitting, in a sense, at a big desk with 100 dials. And each dial reflects one of the values or forces of the universe. There is the mass of the electron, the mass of the proton, the gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, the electroweak force, and so on and so on. And the question is this: why are those numbers set at precisely what they are? What if you were to move in and, let's say, fool with the dials a little bit, change them a little? What would happen? The scientists who asked this question came up with a very startling conclusion, and that is, if you touch the dials, if you fool with them, not to the point of 50% or 20% or even 1%. Stephen Hawking says in his Brief History of Time that if you touch one of the dials, this is the expansion rate of the universe, and move it 1 part in 100,000 millionth million, we would have no universe, we would have no life. In other words, the constants and values of the universe appear to be fine-tuned precisely for, well, us. Now, my question to Dan Dennett. To me, the fine-tuned universe, which, by the way, has no Darwinian explanation, the Darwinian explanation has to do with how one life form became another. Well, I'm going to come back in my rebuttal and discuss what I think is Dan's promiscuous overextension of Darwin into areas that have nothing to do with evolution at all, to claim the prestige of science for very dubious theories about why humans laugh, why do they go to the toilet, and so on. We'll come to that later. What I want to say here is simply this: the laws of the universe are not established in a Darwinian way. And yet, what is the atheist explanation for how they came to be what they are? Why is the universe apparently fine-tuned for life? It would seem, Occam's razor, the logic of simplicity, would seem to say a creator designed it that way. We may not know who built the car, or we may not know who did the painting, but is it even reasonable to suggest that the universe and all its laws created themselves?
Using physics as a shortcut to Christianity is weak. NASA says the universe was hot, dense, and expanding about 13.8 billion years ago, but what triggered early inflation is still unknown. Fine-tuning also has serious non-God explanations, including multiverse theory, new physics, and observer selection. Genesis gets basic order wrong by placing plants before the sun in Genesis 1:11-19. Science leaves questions open. Religion rushes into the gap and calls ignorance proof.
Let me put it a slightly different way. If we think of modern science has spent the last 500 years doing what? Excavating the intelligence built into the laws of nature. We live apparently in a rational universe that reflects extremely complicated laws, right? Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Newton's inverse square law, Einstein's E=mc², and so on. My question is, if our most brilliant scientists have spent their entire lifetime trying to decode the intelligence out of nature, who put it there? Or if not, a good question for Dan, how did it get there? Where did this intelligence come from? What is its explanation? What is your account for why nature obeys laws in the first place? You want to go to other cultures, you realize that this notion of a universe obeying laws is a Western and, in fact, to a large degree, a Christian idea. Other cultures deny it. The Muslim thinker Ghazali says it's absolutely ridiculous, the idea that nature follows laws. You and I can follow a law, but that's because we are intentional, purposeful human beings. We're driving on a road, we see a stop sign, we can follow a law. But can an electron follow a law? Can inanimate objects follow laws? It's preposterous. So Ghazali says the universe exists in the mind of Allah. Things happen because Allah intervenes every second to make them happen in exactly the way they happen. The reason I'm telling you this is I want to suggest that the premises of modern science themselves are based upon Christian metaphysics. The idea that the universe is rational. It obeys laws. These laws are accessible to our human minds. There is no Darwinian reason it must be so. Yes, we evolved, and I agree with Dan about this, but we evolved to survive, if you will, in hunter-gatherer primitive environments. We did not evolve to figure out the rotation of the planets. We did not necessarily evolve to figure out the theory of relativity. So evolution can tell us why we survive and why we adapt, but evolution can't tell us why we believe certain things to be true. Even Stephen Hawking admits this. There is no reason to believe that the stuff going on in your head is made up of atoms and molecules that interact with each other. Now, how do you know that that neuronal firing inside your head must match up and have a one-to-one correspondence with the rationality of the universe out there? Why must it be so? There is no reason. Now, if you're a Christian, you know why it's so. If you're a Christian, you say, I know why the universe is rational. It was created by an omniscient, super-rational God. I know why the universe obeys laws. God is both a physical and, you may say, a moral lawgiver. I know why our rationality can comprehend the universe out there. It's because we are created in God's image. We have a stamp of that divine rationality. So quite apart from our physical nature, formed, I agree, by evolution, we have a moral and a rational nature that allows us, one may say, to go beyond survival and understand truth. Truth that is more than sending my genes into the next generation. I've spoken a little bit about science. How am I on time? I've got 10 more minutes. Okay. I think I can do some more damage. I want to shift a little bit. Away from, I focused a little bit on nature. I want to talk a little bit more now about human nature. Because there is actually an argument for God that doesn't simply require us to contemplate the cosmos. In a sense, it is standing right in front of us. Or to put it somewhat differently, it can be seen by looking a little bit in the mirror. And that is, when we look at nature, let me clarify before I move on. I would agree with Dan that religion, by which I mean the various cultural human descriptions of God, are to a large degree man-made. After all, we are dealing with a sphere of experience, or we are dealing with a sphere of truth that lies beyond human experience. I think really, in some senses in this debate, both Dan and I are, in some senses, a specialized sense, we are both agnostics. And what I mean by that is we are debating a question for which there is not and cannot really be decisive empirical evidence. If I were to say to you, is there life after death? How could we figure this out? Dan might say, well, I don't see any evidence that it's so. Well, what kind of evidence are you waiting for? You want dead people to come back to life and stand up in court and give testimony? Is that what you're waiting for? Then you'll believe? No. All right. So Dan is exactly in the position of that caveman circa 5,000 BC or 10,000 BC, whose whole world was limited to 2 miles from where he was born, and decided on the basis of rational evidence that there could be nothing else out there. Why? Because his little instruments couldn't see them. In other words, how hubristic and narrow-minded of us to assume that all the available information we have now, that's it. That's all we know. And what we don't know can't possibly exist. It's ridiculous. It would have been absurd if we had believed that in the past. Imagine if other scientists had believed that 500 years ago. We deny the existence of all planets outside our solar system. Why? We've seen no evidence of them. This is Dan Dennett circa about 1450. All right, here's the point I want to get at. We have nature, but we also have human nature, and that's us. And we know that although we are part of nature, we are made up of atoms and molecules, we are a little different than the rest of nature in one key respect. Take a stone rolling down a hill. A stone, quite frankly, has no choice in the matter. The stone rolls. It is a product of nature. We, on the other hand, seem to exist in two dimensions. We are products of nature, but we are also products ultimately of free will, of choice, of intentionality, of feelings, of consciousness, of morality. Now I ask you, where can those things be found under the microscope? Have you ever seen consciousness? No. Dan Dennett argues, because he can't see it, it doesn't exist. It's kind of an illusion. It's ultimately a sort of projection or epiphenomenon of material things. Everything has to be reduced to the material. Why? Because ultimately our great wide universe has to be truncated in a Procrustean way to make it fit with materialist morality. Half of our experience, the entire subjective dimension, has to be canceled out. So for Dan, if a computer can process a transaction and you can process a transaction, hey, the computer is being rational. The computer is human in some fundamental sense, no different from you. And why? Because the result is the same. Now, I think this is a bit of foolishness that it really perhaps takes a non-academic to see. In other words, we have knowledge of nature not just from the outside, we are like stones, but we also have choice. Here I am participating in this debate, and our debate is based on free exchange of ideas and free will. I mean, I could put this microphone down and go sit down. Is the firing of my neurons in my head determining my decision? Is it telling me one way or the other? No, I can go either way. I speak, I stop. So the dimension of free will would seem to suggest that there is a part of us that one may say can override the laws of nature. Now, in what way?
Calling nature's order Christian is intellectual theft. The universe had patterns long before churches tried to claim them. Science describes those patterns. It does not need a divine lawgiver. Laws of nature are descriptions of regular behavior, not commands that electrons obey. Human reason also does not prove a soul. Neuroscience has shown that simple choices can be predicted from brain activity before conscious awareness. And the Bible itself says God can send strong delusion, so people believe lies. That is a weak foundation for truth. If God needs mystery, fear, and gaps in science to survive, is that truth or control? Comment your answer, like, and subscribe.